Welcome everybody to this seminar on gender and environmental policy. And thanks a lot to UNECE who made this possible. My name is Gotelind Alber. I'm based in Berlin. I'm an independent researcher and consultant, and I'm also a co-founder and work with GenderCC. That's a global network of gender and climate change experts. So I have a little bit of a bias to climate change policy. So first, I want to give an overview on today's presentation. So first, I want to introduce a couple of examples on how the gender aspects might look in practice in some relevant fields of environmental policy. Then I will go into gender definitions and concepts and briefly touch upon international gender mandates. And then number 4, that's I would say the main part of the training. That's I call it a journey through the gender landscape. This is about the different aspects of gender where they are relevant for environmental policy. Then I will give a brief insight into the steps on how to integrate gender into environmental policies. And finally, I hope we will have some time for questions and answers and a discussion. So the first example is about mobility. And mobility is always a good example for gender aspects because in other sectors, like for instance, the energy sector or for instance, waste, the data we have are on households. And so it's difficult to attribute, let's say, for instance, the energy consumption to the individual members of the household. But with mobility, we have usually data on individuals. So we know a lot about the different travel behavior, for instance, of men and women, or production of waste to the individuals in the household, to women and men and children and so forth. But for mobility, we have a lot of individual data. And from these, we know that women and men have different habits and different behavior in transport. So women usually, in particular, if they do family care work, they have more complex trip patterns because they go to work, they go for shopping, they bring the children to school and so forth. And also women are usually more dependent on public transport and also on cycling and walking. And they have a higher need for safety in public spaces. While we know that men have often a very emotional relation to cars, they drive larger cars, longer distances, and so forth. And so one example I want to present here is just very briefly. So one program we have in Germany, in my home country, is to give pretty high subsidies for electric cars. And from a gender point of view, this is really a problem because all the taxpayers pay for this, but who benefits from this? These are primarily men because first, more men drive cars. Men have a higher income, and therefore they are more than women thinking about buying an electric car because they're still more expensive. So when you think about a Tesla or so, they're really high-class cars. And also cars that are used for business trips, so that are provided by the company or the institution, they're mainly for men. So it's in Germany about 80% of these cars that are provided by the company are for men. And so everybody pays, but only men benefit. And so from my point of view, or from a gender point of view, a better solution would be to invest more in clean, accessible and affordable and also safe public transport, and also in the walkability and I say bikeability, this so that streets, the bike lanes are there's a better infrastructure, they are more safe and so on. And another thing, so when you invest in public transport, I think it's also important to look who's going to get the jobs. So usually drivers of buses and trams and so on, it's mainly men, and so there are some public transport companies, for instance, in Vienna, they have programs to include women, to specifically train women and to promote that women also get part of these jobs. Another example, gender aspects of consumption and waste. I heard that waste is a big issue in Serbia, and that it's supposed to be one of the priority areas. I've also seen some documents on waste programs, which I found very interesting. And so the usual strategy for waste is to prevent waste, so reduce waste, reuse, which means separate and then recycle. But when I looked through these documents, I didn't find any reference to women or gender. And I think we should be aware that it's mainly women who make these small everyday consumption choices. So who go for shopping, for instance, for food. That's usually mainly women, while men, they are often in charge of the big investments. So for instance, heating systems or so, but women are usually in most countries in charge of like 80% of consumption expenditures. And so they are the ones who decide so if they buy a product with a lot of packaging, or if they buy too much food and there is food waste afterwards. And also women are usually in charge of waste management at home. So if there is a system of waste separation into different fractions, it will be mainly the women who are supposed to do this. And the example I have here is a program in Ukraine funded by various international donors, and among many other activities, there is also a part of this program is upgrading municipal waste management services. And within this program, they put a lot of emphasis on women. So to communicate the value of waste as a resource, so in order to promote separation of waste for recycling, and also to empower the women, as they say, agents of change, so through awareness raising activities. And I think that is a very good approach, because the first step for environmental policy is always communication to the citizens. And already in the communication activities, we should take gender issues into account, because women and men, they have different communication habits, they have different sources of information they rely on, and they have different technical skills. And so it's important to know who is my audience, who is my target group I want to address, and to adapt the communication accordingly. But I think what should be additionally taken into consideration is that these waste management activities, they might create an additional workload for women who are in charge of household work. And so the question is how to make it easier for them, how to design the waste management system. So for instance, the separation system, different waste bins, so that it doesn't lead to much additional work, or how to offer separation bins. And in general, I think also one result of a gender perspective is, from my point of view, that not all the responsibility should be put on the private household, because women who are often in charge of this, they have a scarcity of time, and often a lot of pressure. They have usually less leisure time than men, because in addition to employment, they do the household work. And so I think at least as much emphasis should be put on the public services, and also on the production side. For instance, in Germany, we have a campaign on reducing food waste, but this campaign is only addressing private households. But a lot of the food waste is generated in the production, on the production side. And I think this must be addressed as well. So these are my examples. And now I will come to the part 2, gender concepts. I think most of us know the difference between gender and sex, so gender, socially constructed roles and norms, gender power relations, and these roles and norms, they can change over time. They're different in different nations, and that differs from the term sex, which is to characterize the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women. So physiology, genes and hormones and so on. And interestingly, this distinction is not 100% clear, because depending on the roles they play, also the hormones change in people. So for instance, men who do a lot of care work, so care for a baby, their hormone system changes a little bit. So it's interconnected, but still I think it makes sense to make this distinction. And when we talk about gender mainstreaming, of course, we also talk about sex, about the biological characteristics, but I think we talk mainly about the socially constructed roles and norms and relations. And so when we come to more advanced gender concepts, so the discussion is at the moment at the point where we do not only distinguish between men on one side and women on the other side, but we realize that there is something like a continuum, that most people are not, let's say, 100% male as society defines male, and not 100% of the women have the characteristics that are attributed to women, but most people are somewhere in between. And while we have all the LGBTIQ and asterisk communities, so this rigid definition of male and female is now going to be sort of dissolved, and there is more variety in gender roles. And another, also what I wanted to mention is that often when we speak about gender, people think women, but that's not the case. Of course, we speak more often about women, because women usually are the, let's say, disadvantaged gender. But it's not only about women, and particularly if we talk about environmental policy, we also need to talk about masculinity. So I think many of you heard the term toxic masculinity, and usually when people use this term, it's not meant that it's, you know, in a chemical way toxic, but when we speak about environmental policy, we can often see that there is really some toxic masculinity in terms of, for instance, what I said about transport behavior and so forth. So another thing I want to briefly explain is, so when we talk about gender, we should also look at the difference between within the group of women and within the group of men, because these are not homogeneous groups, because different social categories like gender, class, migration status, age, they overlap and intersect, and often they mutually reinforce. So for instance, when we look at poor communities, then we see that usually the poorest of them are women. So there it's that class and gender overlap, and reinforce each other. And so we have to be aware that people have multiple identities, so as a woman, as a poor person, as a migrant, and so forth. And in science, in social science, people try to do intersectional analysis, but that's really difficult because we have these many categories, and so we have a lot of subcategories. And so our approach is, or my approach is, to make it a little bit simpler, to use gender as a starting point, but then once we looked into gender, then also to look into other social categories, which is a little bit easier to handle than you know, every intersection. The gender framework we use is based on different levels, because often when we talk about LGBTI or so, this is primarily about gender identities at the individual level. But when we talk about policy and about gender mainstreaming, I think it's important to notice that there is also other levels. There is the so-called symbolic level. So these are the norms, the social norms and values. And what we see here is that the male characteristics and perspectives in most societies are considered the norm, and the female is considered as sort of a deviation from the norm, the other. And also what we see is that that the systems we create, be it like spatial systems or institutional or physical structures, they sort of reflect these gender issues. So for instance, in the spatial structures we have in many cities, they reflect the separation between the public space and the private space. And the extreme are like, for instance, American cities where, you know, business takes place in the center, and the women who are not employed but work at home, they're very far away in just a living quarter. So we see this also in our structures, and this mutually reinforces. So we are sort of influenced by the structures we find. So we call that doing gender, and then we try to usually to behave accordingly. And when we talk about policies, I think we have to mainly address the symbolic and systemic levels. So why should we take gender into account into environmental policy? So from my point of view, there are two main arguments. So one is policy will be more effective because we know the target groups better, their preferences, their capacities, also acceptability will be better. And the other big argument that shouldn't be forgotten is that now I'm talking from a women's perspective, that it's our right to be involved, and that measures are, policy measures are also meeting our requirements and our needs. Otherwise, inequalities might increase. And what we achieve if we with environmental policies at the same time contribute to gender equalities, that we minimize negative social impacts and maximize the positive impacts. So there's quite a number of gender mandates in place to integrate gender into environmental policy. So there is the oldest convention on this is CEDAW, and CEDAW has produced now a number of decisions, in particular on climate change and gender, promoting that gender must be taken into account, in particular in climate change adaptation. And then the most, I would say, still valid international mandate comes from the Beijing platform from 1995. And already at that time, the mandate was very strong because it was on one hand involve the women, so ensure equal participation, but then also integrate gender concerns and perspectives in policies and programs. And so, for instance, strengthen mechanisms for gender impact assessment. And I think these two requirements that come from the Beijing platform, I would say in most countries, they're not yet met. So I think this is still a long way to achieve this. And then for international conventions, so CBD, the biodiversity conventions, and the Convention on Desertification, they from the beginning mentioned women, and they have gender action plans and try to address women. Also, of course, we know that Agenda 2030, there is the goal number 5 on gender. That should be a cross-cutting issue across all other themes like climate change, energy, and so forth. And then we have the UNFCCC, which started as a convention that completely neglected gender and social issues, but has a lot improved, not through a number of governments, but also through the pressure of NGOs, like, for instance, the network I am working with. And now we have gender as part of the Paris Agreement. And since 1990, since the last COP, we have an enhanced UN Gender Action Plan. And what we're doing here is exactly meeting the requirements of the Gender Action Plan, which calls for much more training and capacity building on one hand, for women to take part in this process, and on the other hand, for everybody to do gender mainstreaming, to do gender analysis, to do gender budgeting in climate change policy. And finally, I want to mention the New Urban Agenda, which is a document that is not so well known. It comes from a process, from Habitat 3 process, so led by the UN Habitat. And so this New Urban Agenda is like a plan, an action plan for municipalities, how to achieve this sustainable city development. And but not cities have adopted this agenda, but national governments. And therefore, from my point of view, national governments have the obligation to work with cities, to support cities, to guide cities, to implement this action plan. And the New Urban Agenda is very gender sensitive or gender responsive. So at many places in this urban agenda, it's talking about gender responsive urban planning, gender responsive transport planning, and so forth. So now we're coming to the main part of the training, and that's about, we call them gender dimension. So in the program, I said I said a journey through the gender landscape, and I think this gender dimension, they open up the gender landscape. What we mean by gender dimension is spheres of life where gender is particularly important. And to look at these dimensions will also later on might help us to do gender analysis. And so the first gender dimension, of course, is representation and participation in decision making, because we know that still in environmental policy, in particular in certain sectors like energy and transport, women are very much underrepresented. Also in key implementation sectors like construction, of course, and also in energy utilities. So not only on the planning side, but also on the implementation side. And that might lead to a male bias in planning and decision making, and a lack of inclusion of gender expertise in the relevant development of technologies and development of politics. And also at household levels, there might be a gender bias. So I have here the numbers from Serbia. And in particular, at local level, so the share of women is still very low, and I think that is always the first step that needs to be done to improve the participation of women, not only in formal decision making, but also in participatory processes. So the next dimension, that is what I said earlier, the symbolic level, so the gender roles and norms. And I think these are these are still in our societies very, very strong, and they have a major influence on environmental behavior of people, because at individual level, so perceptions, attitudes, and preferences vary substantially between the genders. So, for instance, in most countries, for women, it's much more important to avoid harming the environment. They're much more in favor of renewables and energy efficiency, and also women usually reject risky technologies like nuclear power, like carbon capture and storage, like geoengineering or so. I don't have any numbers from Serbia, but I have numbers from many countries, and there from there it's very clear that women are also more willing to change their own behavior. It's not clear whether they really do it, but they are motivated to change their behavior, while men usually expect more from technological solutions. And I think it's important from many aspects of environmental policy to take this into account, because I think one thing is that should be noted, that if we want people to support environmental policies and also like legislation and so on, the women are our supporters. A majority of women are our supporters. I think we should be aware of this. But this has also, as I mentioned before, a structural level. That is, for instance, in institutions, even though there are more and more women now in working in institutions, in particular in the environmental sector, but still in most institutions, male norms and approaches and methods are prevalent. The characteristics and activities that are attributed to women are less valued in society. And this starts at a very early age. So what you see on the right, so it's in German. I didn't find an English version. So these are this Kinder Surprise. So these chocolate eggs for children, and so they have gendered chocolate eggs. So for the boys, it's called World Champion. So that was during some football world championship. But for the girls, it's the wife of the player. So it's not the world champion, the female world champion. It's just the wife of the player. And I think that shows very clearly how also all these companies, that sell all these pink things, how they maybe involuntarily, because they just want to make more profit, but support these gender norms. And usually there are always more constraints on women due to gender role than on men. On men, on the other hand, are higher expectations. They should not cry and so on, which is also might also be harmful for many men. So that's about gender roles and norms. And I don't know, did you open this Padlet link? You will find it at the beginning of the chat.
Kathleen, maybe you can
Yes.
share once more in the chat box. It's quite
Yeah,
at the beginning of
I
the
need
chat.
to
Okay,
stop
I
the
can do it.
sharing. Yeah, I can do that. No problem. Um, so where is it?
Yes, now Tony, I think, sent the link. So the link is padlet.com.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay, thank you.
everyone can find it in the chat box.
So I will again share my screen. And so, oops. So you can enter your IDs into this Padlet. So for each of the gender dimensions, not for the first one, because I think participation, equal participation is an issue of its own, and I think we're all aware that women are underrepresented in many spheres of life. So I didn't put that in, but for the other gender dimensions, there is one column. And I would ask you to think about your specific field of work. Maybe you work on waste policy or on climate policy or on energy policy or whatever. And maybe you have ideas how the specific gender dimension, how this could get relevant in your policy area. And don't be shy, just because it's anonymous, you don't need to enter your name. And you just go on the plus and can enter some text. I don't know if you ever used Padlet. So there is one person that is very quick and is already with resources and infrastructures. I would ask you to first look at gender norms, and then while we're going through the various dimensions, then also add things to the other dimensions. But feel free to do as you want. Should I wait for a second for you to generate ideas on how gender roles and norms could be relevant for the policy field you're working? Well, let's go into the next dimension. Somebody entered something or is working on. So there is an E. Well, that's a good start. So you just type in, and then when you go out with the mouse out of this little box, then it will stay. But you can also, if you go to the dots, you can also delete it if you, and if you go again into this little box, you can change it. And if you like the boxes, so that was the comments of others, you can also give a star and rate it higher. So you don't need to repeat things that have been said already. Okay, so let's go to the next dimension, that is the market economy. So that is about wages, salaries, pensions, and the wealth that people accumulate during their lifetime. And I think we all know there is a gender pay gap, and the graph I have on the right side, that is how the gender pay gap evolved in Serbia during the last 13 years or so. So from 2004 to 2017. I don't know if you can see the numbers on your screen. And I think this is really worrying that the wage gap between men and women is increasing over time in Serbia. So I think it's not our job in environmental policy, but maybe something should be done about this. And the problem is that this gender pay gap that results also in an even larger gender pension gap and wealth gap. So, for instance, in Germany, the gender pay gap is about 22% at the moment, but the gender pension gap is 50%, which means that poverty in Germany is mainly a question of older elderly women. So they are the ones that are the poorest. And for instance, that is when we come to environmental policy, this is then about, for instance, energy poverty or also mobility poverty, that they cannot afford to use maybe a taxi, what they would need to get somewhere. And what we also have is an employment gap, which is in most countries getting smaller. But we have in most countries, a relatively high share of part-time work of women because they are still in charge of family care, and so they're going for a part-time job, which of course then also has consequences for their pensions. Then we have what I call horizontal and vertical segregation. That means in the work sphere, we have a segregation between, so we have much more men in leading positions. So that's a vertical segregation than women. And we have a horizontal segregation, which means certain jobs are favored, certain sectors are favored by women and certain sectors are favored by men. That is, of course, a result of the last dimension we have been talking about, the gender norms. But the problem is that the jobs that are usually done by women are less salaried than typical male jobs. So for instance, in Germany, a nurse or the person who helps a doctor at the dentist, she earns much less than, for instance, a man who repairs cars, even though their education is the same in terms of length and difficulties. But typical male jobs are usually higher salaried. And so that when some people say, well, but it's your own decision that you choose for a job that is less salaried, but it's the other way around, that society puts a lower value on these, for instance, care jobs. And one of the results is also gaps in land and building ownership. So I've seen data from Serbia on this as well. And poorer housing, energy, mobility, poverty, and in particular, so the precarious jobs are often held by women. So their financial situation is not safe. And of course, this has consequences for environmental policy because while one of the key instruments of environmental policies are like fees and taxes. So for instance, carbon trading systems, which lead to higher prices of energy or direct carbon taxation or taxation on waste and so forth. Or also, if we improve the waste management system, it might get more expensive, and if this is then distributed among the consumers, then also the cost per consumer will be higher. So with all these kind of policies and measures, they hurt the people more who have a lower income. And here we see very clearly the intersection between class or income class and gender. But usually the poorest are women, in particular lone mothers. So at least in my countries, they have the worst, let's say, housing situation and so forth. So I just look into the Padlet. If you, yeah, there's something going on. So and this dimension I find extremely important because this is a sector, the care economy, that is often completely neglected by policymakers. So we call it's externalized from the market economy, and it's all this work that is needed to cook meals, to educate the children, to care for older people, and so forth. also to do the cleaning and washing and so forth, that is externalized in the private household. And the entire society and the market is blind for this work. So it's not recognized as a part of the economy, and so we won't see it in the economic data. And we know that there is a substantial, I call it care gap between women and men. And so I looked up the numbers for Serbia. And in Serbia, women spend on average more than 2 hours more than men on unpaid labor at home, which means this comes on top of their employed work and at the cost of, for instance, leisure time. And so I have already spoken about the time scarcity of women. That's a result of this. And of course, also from the care work, there are other requirements, for instance, on mobility, what I mentioned already, but also, for instance, on energy. So those people, mainly women who stay at home, they need more heating because in the winter they are at home, they're more exposed to indoor pollution. So I think this is something we have to think about. And often exactly this dimension is neglected by policymakers, and therefore I'm so much emphasizing it. And so the next dimension is access to resources and infrastructures. So usually in the global south, we speak only access to natural resources, but in our countries, which are more or less highly industrialized, we usually don't bring the water from the well. I know there are some people still in Serbia who don't have access to piped water, but I think it's a minority, and most people have access to infrastructure in order to get energy, to transport services, water, and so forth. And the question is how, which needs do these infrastructures meet? So who does the planning of these infrastructures in what interest? So for instance, mobility systems in cities, they're very often biased towards commuters. So people who, primarily men, who go from home to work and back. So in most cities, so there is like a radial structure of the main public transport lines for the commuters who work, who live outside the city and come to the city center for work, or in the meantime, sometimes it's vice versa. But for the women who do the care work, the infrastructure is often not adequate because they have multiple trips, and they're often radial, not they're often tangential, not radial. And so sometimes it's for them very hard to get from one point to the other, and then they will use the car if they have one instead of public transport. And of course, we want to use them public transport. Also, for instance, the walking and biking infrastructure in many cities is not safe. So, for instance, for biking, we know that in those countries who have a good bike infrastructure, that is, for instance, Denmark and Netherlands, a majority of women are biking, or the majority of bikers are women. And this is because we heard earlier that women are more, they think they should be more environmentally friendly. So they would love to go by bike, but they need better infrastructure. While in countries with a less good infrastructure, like in Germany, only less than 50% of the bikers are women. So this is something we need to take into consideration when we want people to bike or also to walk. Because a lot of small trips can be done by walking if the walking infrastructure is safe and if it's possible to go with a children's cart or so. And the problem is that these requirements of care and also of the normal everyday life are often not sufficiently met by the planners. Also, for instance, playgrounds. So who has access, or who uses the public space? So if we look at cities, a lot of the public space is used by cars, either by cars that are driven or cars that are standing around. And if we compare to public spaces like parks or playgrounds, I think there is really a bias towards cars. And I think every modern city planner is somehow aware of this. But I think we should be clear that it has a lot to do with care and everyday life requirements. The next aspect I want to look briefly into is our institutional and legal aspects. So in many countries, even though in the, let's say, in the constitution, men and women should have equal rights, there should be LGBTIQ rights and so forth, but in practice, often there is still some legal discrimination of women. So for instance, in my country, we have a tax regime that allows the splitting of taxes between a husband and a wife, and it works in the end. The result of it is that the couple saves taxes, but at the cost of the woman. In particular now, we've seen this now during Corona times, when these people had to go on short work and they get support from the government if they work shorter hours, but as the net salary of the women is lower, also their support scheme is not so much benefiting them. So there's still some well, I would say legal gaps, and also gaps in implementing legal provisions. So for instance, in terms of LGBTIQ rights in most countries where there are these rights, they're still not ensured that these people are can move around safely. So I'm looking now a little bit into the Padlet. So yes. Yeah, thanks for your input. So please continue generating ideas. So the last gender dimension I want to go into is now finally the part that also has to do with physiological differences with sex, but also it's both sex and gender. So it's about bodies, about health, but also about intimacy and freedom of violence. And I would say sexual harassment, that is primarily a gender problem of gender roles, because it's primarily not so much about sex as such, but about power, having power over another person. And this is a problem that restricts women a lot in the public space. And now during Corona, we've learned that this problem is also still really severe at home and has increased during the lockdown due to Corona. I think in all countries I have seen data from. So this problem that generates a lot of requirements for spatial planning, for urban planning, for transport planning, in order to ensure better safety for women in public spaces. Then we have physiological differences. For instance, comfort temperature. Usually women like it a little bit warmer, because their body doesn't produce so much waste heat. So men are a little bit, their bodies are more wasteful. Women work more efficiently. So that means that in winter, women use a little bit more energy. But what's also interesting that women, it's also relevant for the summer now, in particular, where summers are getting hotter due to climate change, and many offices have now cooling systems. that women would prefer a slightly higher temperature and therefore would save some energy in these places. But usually the cooling systems, they are adjusted and controlled by men, and so they are controlled to, let's say, 20 degrees or so, and that's for women usually too cold. And interestingly, women can think better when it's a little bit warmer. So it really has some interesting consequences. There is more exposure to indoor pollution of women who work at home. Then we have also some gendered requirements regarding hygiene and sanitation that is relevant for the water sector and is also particularly relevant for the impacts of climate change. So if we have catastrophes like flooding or whatever, and these infrastructures are interrupted, so it's often more problematic for the women in general. So women are usually more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, also due to their roles, due to care work, because they have to care for the sick. They are usually in charge of, cleaning up, while the men are more doing the, let's say, heroic things. So in most countries, we have, for instance, more fatalities among women after catastrophes. But in some countries, we have more fatalities among men because they try to take some big risks to rescue people. So it's not everywhere that women are disadvantaged. Or for instance, in Australia, we have more suicides among men because they take less care of their own mental health problem, while women, they ask for support, and men do not do that so much. And this is a result of the hot summers they have, and it's primarily farmers that commit suicide because they're desperate because their farm is going bankrupt. And also in some countries, we have a problem with the access to health services. And also, I think many of you know that also medicine, so the science, the medical science, has for a long time has completely neglected that female bodies are different and they respond different and they have different symptoms to male bodies. So this is something we're just learning in the medical sector. So, so these were the gender dimension, and I want to make a brief stop here and ask for questions, or for if you don't want to enter your comments in the Padlet, so maybe you want to say your comments. You can, of course, also, if you have a problem with the Padlet, you can, of course, also use the chat. I'm stopping the screen sharing for a minute in order to see if there's anything going on in the chat. So please feel free to ask questions or to comment. I hope that everybody is still awake and that you haven't fallen asleep.
Yeah, Gotland. So
Yes.
I'm just monitoring the chat box. There was no question so far, but there was an earlier remark that if the recording will be available. So yes, indeed, the recording will be available, and I hope that you can also share your presentation, right?
Of course,
Okay,
yes.
so this is why it's important that for those who are not yet posted the name and the organizations, please do so that we can send you the link to the recording and also a copy of the presentation after the training today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I will still leave a little bit time because we're very well in time. So so if you have comments, also critical comments are welcome. Or if you have questions, don't hesitate.
Yes, just not a question, but just a comment. I'm a bit surprised the link between heat and women and men. So I think it's more
Between what?
the heat and women and
Heat.
men.
Yeah. Mhm.
Sorry for my French accent. And I'm not sure that this is not a generality. I don't know if this applies Nordic countries versus South countries. But just I don't know from where the study is made, but I'm really
The study was so that women can think better when it's a little bit warmer. Of course, not tropical heat, but when it's a bit warmer, that comes from the US because they have all everywhere they have these cooling systems and so they're also doing a lot of research about this. And I think that women feel cold when it's like 20 degrees. That it's both sex and gender. It's because their bodies work a little bit differently, so they need it a bit warmer. But of course, it's also often the clothes they wear because they don't wear a suit, but this more light
okay.
thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's both factors that might be relevant. So if there are no questions at the moment, I would say we go on, and in the end we still have some time for questions or for your comments and your inputs and discussions. So I will share again the screen. Yes. Oops. Okay. So now how to move forward once we know all these relevant factors. So what I suggest is a sort of a step-by-step approach. Um, and the first step should always be to include gender also in the general objectives about environment and climate change. So, for instance, what I suggest for cities is who enter a commitment to climate policy, that they say they want to work towards a low carbon, clean, resilient, inclusive, socially and gender just city or society. So to include gender into the objectives, and then next step is at an institutional level to involve the gender institutions. And that in many countries that's quite a big problem because the people in the environmental field, they're often natural scientists, and the people in the gender institutions, they're coming more from social science or political science, and so it's often very in the beginning very hard to find a common language. I think I know this myself because I'm a natural scientist, I'm a physicist, and everything I learned about gender, I learned, let's say, more or less by doing. But still, sometimes I have a problem when I work with social scientists. So we, for instance, do research projects together, and their approaches are different, and for me sometimes very abstract because as a physicist, I want to have very concrete and tangible things. So, but I think it's worth to enter this dialogue, and I think it's a learning process for both sides because, of course, the gender institutions, they're usually not so competent on environmental issues. But I think they should also be aware that they can do a lot to promote gender equality, but environment is so important, and in particular, climate change has so much influence and will have on our societies that they must also address these kind of policies and ensure that gender is included as in social policies, because otherwise discrimination by gender, by migration status, by whatever, will increase. We know that through climate change. Climate change impacts usually increase, aggravate inequalities. And then the third step is, of course, the big task of improving gender balance at all levels, and also to ensure meaningful participation of women and women's organizations in participatory in consultation processes. I suppose that you also have consultation processes in Serbia on certain policies, and it's very important to involve women's organizations, but usually, as for the gender institutions, it should be considered to offer them some kind of a training beforehand. So, for instance, in my country, so I'm working with a women and gender organization, but it's an international organization. But with the German women's organizations, they do not yet work on really on environment and climate change. I have tried a number of times to convince them to work on this, because it's such an important issue for all of our future. But they still are very much focused on gender-based violence and these kind of things, which I completely understand, but I think they shouldn't neglect environmental and climate change policies. And therefore, usually it's necessary to offer them first some training in order to help them to meaningfully participate in consultation processes. If it's like at national levels, so at community levels, it's different because of course then at community level, so if for instance cities in a neighborhood consult about how should the waste management system look like, of course then the women are already the experts, because they are the experts of housekeeping and how they themselves manage the waste. And in this situation, it's important that they are heard, that they're part of the meeting, and that the other people listen to what they can say. And so the next step is to consider gender roles in communication and policy making. So I have in the beginning already talked about gender-sensitive communication. I think that's very important. So for instance, what we learned about energy advice, for instance, energy advice, how to save energy in the household and what to do to energetically improve your house, to refurbish your building. So this advice is mainly done by males, by men, because they have the technical skills and the technical education to do that. And so it's actually mainly addressing men and women who look at the brochures they get, they usually don't read them. And so it's necessary for such information to think about how can we present the information in order to address also the women, or to address the women specifically, because usually women have much less knowledge on energy. Also, they think they should do something to save energy, but they're not aware of their own energy consumption. They don't have the numbers, and they're not aware how much, a refrigerator, how much energy a refrigerator uses compared to, let's say, a hairdryer or so. And so I think this is relevant information, and it should be communicated in a way that they would like to read it. And this is also, it's a question of language, but it's also a question of the visual things, like also showing women and not only showing men who show the women how it works, but showing women in an active role and so forth. And then also, of course, in policy making as such, a gender role should be considered, and this can be tricky. So in the beginning, I said environmental policy will be more effective if gender roles are taken into consideration. But if it's only taken into consideration, it could also mean that gender roles are sort of cemented, are even strengthened. If I address women specifically in their care role and men specifically in their role as whatever sportsman or the tough guy or so. And so this is really an art of gender-sensitive communication and policy to avoid even strengthening the gender roles. And therefore, we suggest to develop a systematic approach and include gender impact assessment with the criteria of that environmental policy, of course, should meet the environmental goals, but should also contribute to gender equality, to improve gender equality. And this is what gender analysis or gender impact instrument as a tool is supposed to do, to look at the policies in the planning stage and estimate what might their impacts on men and women or on different genders be, and then, if necessary, then modify the policies. And we use these gender dimensions as spotlights to detect the gender aspects of a policy, because for many policies it's really difficult to see gender aspects. So, for instance, I've seen your clean air policy. So if it's about like big power installations, I must say I can't see so much gender dimension in that. If it's regulation about, let's say, big power plants or so. But for other things, the gender issues might also be not visible at the first glance. But if you look deeper into this gender dimension, so might it influence somehow the care work? Might it influence, will jobs be created? So who will benefit from the jobs that will be created? So also these distributional effects. Then these spotlights, these dimensions help us to detect what might be the gendered impact. And then finally, of course, gender issues should also be included into monitoring. So that means gender indicators. And I have seen that there is some kind of a guidance around in Serbia about gender indicators, and also gender budgeting, which is of course not covering all the policies, because gender budgeting does not cover legislation, but just what is budget relevant. But it's still an important tool. And I saw in some document that there is that gender budgeting is mandatory in Serbia. Is that true? Because in many countries there are a lot of efforts on gender budgeting, gender responsive budgeting, also at the city level. So for instance, Berlin, my home city, they are a forerunner in gender budgeting. But interestingly, they do it only in the social sectors, and they don't use it for environmental policies. And maybe that is the same in Serbia, that maybe for some sectors they use gender budgeting, but I suppose not for environment and climate policy. That is my assumption, at least. But I saw that there is some provision on gender budgeting around, and I even saw in some document that there is a provision on social and gender impact assessment around in Serbia, and I also suppose it's not really implemented, and so in this way Serbia is not different than, for instance, a country like Germany, because Germany, they always say, yes, we implement what we say, but they don't do it as well. So because there's also a provision that gender impact assessment should be applied in environmental policies, and there were some experiments, some pilot projects 15 years ago already, but then after these pilot projects nothing happened, and it was not implemented. And now, only since 2 years, additional efforts are taking we helped also to improve the methodology and to provide better guidance. And now there are additional efforts to really do it in the daily work. So, and finally, there's still a lot of open questions. And this, so of course, the big questions for you as policymakers is, so if you cannot do a systematic gender assessment, that you ask at least, are there gender typical attitudes, preferences, consumption patterns, and also capacities to act in the relevant field? And the other questions, how can we influence them? And how can we take the care work into consideration? And also all this without cementing gender roles. Because, you know, the first example I mentioned about the waste policy, that is happening often when policymakers try to take gender into account. They see that the women are more open and more aware and more concerned about environment. They are more willing to do something for the environment, and then they focus on women, which means that in the end, let's say the women are more and more environmentally friendly, but what about the men? So we need to, because they go with the big cars and they produce, so for instance, single men produce a lot of waste because they don't cook, they often use ready-made food and so forth. Or for instance, also the eating habits. Men usually eat much more meat, and therefore their carbon footprint, their individual carbon footprint is larger than the carbon footprint of women. And that's primarily because of eating habits and of transport behavior. And therefore, the question is how to address environmentally harmful masculinity. I think that needs a lot of thinking, because there is some experience around that even sometimes when men say, let's say in a restaurant or among friends, when they say I'm a vegetarian, then other men ask you, are you gay that you're a vegetarian? So it's so much connected with the male roles, and I think this is also a task of environmental policymakers to challenge these gender roles when we see they are harmful for the environment. Another question is, so who the cost-benefit ratio? So who bears the costs? Is it all the taxpayers? And who is benefiting from certain subsidies or from the additional jobs created through the policy? So one, I would say, a bit negative example in terms of gender is the feed-in law we have in Germany, or had in Germany. Now it's pretty much modified, so to promote renewable energy. So in principle, I think the system was very good. So not the taxpayer, but the consumer of electricity paid an extra charge, and all the renewable installations, they got an additional price for the electricity fed into the grid. And in the beginning, they got a really high price, so that the investment was cost effective. And it really was a success story, because the huge increase we had in Germany on renewable energies was mainly due to this system, and also the decrease of the price of photovoltaics, for instance. Now everybody in the world can afford photovoltaics, and I would say that it was to a certain degree was the German consumers who paid for that, because at that time German photovoltaic industry, they made a lot of efforts to bring the costs down. But for the women, it meant they paid also through the electricity costs for the system, but they did not so much benefit from it because they could do much less investments. So only 1/4 of the investments was made by women, and also only 1/4 of the jobs that were created by the system went to women. And so if such a system is introduced, it would be necessary to think about additional policies and measures to counteract this imbalance and this inequality. And my final question would be, how can we challenge these structural inequalities and power relations in order to achieve a transformation? Because I think, in particular, environmental policy makers, I think we all know that all our societies have to undergo a deep transformation if we want to have sustainable societies. And I think this transformation also needs to address gender roles. Thank you very much.